The 9950 X3D2 is a CPU that probably shouldn't exist. Double X3D caches sounds insane on paper, but it doesn't exactly translate to double gaming performance. The interconnect between the two CCDs is still a bottleneck, so you can't just magically combine both caches and get one giant super CPU. AMD knew this, and this is probably why this chip wasn't originally supposed to happen, but eventually they said F it and released it anyway for nerds and enthusiasts like myself. So for most people, this CPU probably makes no sense, but it is one of the most interesting CPUs AMD has released in a long time, and for Tarkov, you know I had to test it. So today we're comparing the 9950 X3D2 against the current top dog, the 9850 X3D. Both CPUs were tested on the exact same setup. I'm using an ASRock X870E Nova, 64 gigs of SK Hynix A die at 6000 CL30, an Orico 07000 Gen 4 M2 SSD, and for graphics I've got my Zotac Solid 5090, so we're as GPU unlimited as possible and actually seeing CPU performance. In terms of tuning, the X3D2 was running Tarkov on the second CCD only. This was done through Process Lasso. I did not disable the first CCD in BIOS. When this chip was released, I tested a bunch of different configurations, and this was the best performing setup. Besides that, both CPUs were running the same PBO tune, plus 200 boost clock override, minus 15 curve optimizer undervolt, SMT was off, and resizable bar was on. Both of these chip samples actually hit 2200 F clock, so that was awesome, and both were running the U clock and M clock at 1:1. In game, I'm using my Pure 70 preset, which is my optimized high texture settings. The goal here is to push enough GPU usage while still making sure we're testing the CPU. For the actual benchmark, I focused on the most demanding section of the most demanding map in the game, Streets of Tarkov. I ran my usual route from Klimov Street into Lexos, first in offline mode with no AI to get baseline numbers, and then in online raids to get real world results. 3 runs per CPU at each resolution, and I really hope this stuff is helpful because this data does take forever to gather properly, especially getting the live runs in. Also, just keep in mind, these FPS numbers are going to look lower than what you'd normally see in an average raid, and that's completely normal. I'm not trying to show best case numbers. This route is specifically chosen to hammer the CPU and make those differences easier to see when comparing CPU performance. In a normal raid, your overall average FPS is probably going to be higher than what you see here. So I really consider this the floor for performance. So let's get into the numbers. At 1080 offline, the 9950 X3D2 averaged 158 FPS compared to 151 on the 9850 X3D. The lows were also better with 127 and 115 for the 1% and 0.1% lows versus 120 and 110 on the 9850. So it's leading by about 5% in all categories. Not a massive gap, but it is there. At 1440 offline, the results are basically the same story. X3D2 averaged 157 FPS, while the 9850 averaged 150. 1% lows were 126 versus 118, and the 0.1% lows were 114 versus 107. At 4K offline, the 9950 X3D2 averaged 155 FPS averaged 155 FPS compared to 148 on the 9850 X3D. Again, a noticeable difference here in the 1% lows, 125 for the X3D2 versus 115. That's basically a 10% improvement, and that is pretty meaningful in terms of in-game feel. At 1080 online, the 9950 X3D2 averaged 140 FPS, while the 9850 X3D averaged 130. Lows were higher as well, 113 and 102 for the X3D2 compared to 104 and 95 for the 9850. At 1440 online, the X3D2 averaged 137 FPS compared to 128 on the 9850. 1% lows were actually kind of close here, 109 versus 103. 0.1% lows were 99 versus 91. Gap opened up a little bit as the resolution went up. At 4K online, the 9950 X3D2 averaged 134, while the 9850 X3D averaged 125 FPS. The 1% lows were 106 versus 95, and the 0.1% lows were 100 versus 88. So that's good confirmation that this route is still CPU heavy enough to use as grounds for comparison of the two chips. So overall, In offline mode, it was about a 5% gap across the board. Moving into online, that gap opened up to about 7-ish%. And it's not a gigantic gap, but it was enough to make it feel slightly smoother on the X3D2. For temps in game, I expected the X3D2 to run a little warmer, but they were basically identical. Both CPUs averaged around 67 degrees, so thermals were a non-issue. Power draw was where the X3D2 really showed its weight, I guess. The 9950 X3D2 averaged around 110 watts compared to 79 on the 9850 X3D. And even the 9850 X3D is pushing a lot more power for a small gain compared to the 9800 X3D, which draws even less power. So yeah, that's about a 39% increase in power draw over the 9850 X3D and probably about 50% increase over the 9800. So while the performance is better, the payoff is a huge drop off in efficiency. You're getting a small but noticeable FPS uplift, but you're burning through a lot more power to get there. So at this point, we've already established that the 9950 X3D2 is not a good value, and that was obvious before the testing even started. Compared to the 9850 X3D in Tarkov, it does give you a small boost in average FPS when configured to run on the second CCD. But the bigger difference is really in the lows, especially in the 0.1% lows where we saw gains close to 10% in some tests. I think the lows arguably matter more than the averages because those are what usually translate to smoothness. In game, I could feel the X3D2 being just a little bit smoother in the heavier areas of streets, especially when the game got hectic or when moving through the most demanding sections of the map. So putting value aside and just looking at raw performance, yes, the 9950 X3D2 is technically the best Tarkov CPU available today, but it's still really hard to recommend it over something like the 9850 or the 9800 X3D, because even though it is faster, it's not a huge gap, and it costs nearly twice as much as those chips. So for most people, I would not recommend the CPU, but if you are chasing the absolute best Tarkov performance, maybe cost is not really a factor for you, or you're just a nerdy enthusiast like me who loves to test cool hardware, then I think you might be someone who would want to check this chip out. So that's all I got for this one, guys. I hope it was helpful. If this video helped you make a decision on a purchase, please consider using the affiliate links down below to help support the channel. It really does help me to continue bringing you comparisons like this and the info you need. So either way, thank you guys for all the amazing support. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.